Good afternoon. I'm Tom Putnam, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and on behalf of Tom McNaught, Executive Director of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you all for coming, and our C-SPAN viewers for tuning in. I also acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsor, Bank of America, Raytheon, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, the Boston Foundation, and our media partners, the Boston Globe and WBUR. Let me state from the outset, as clearly as I can, that few individuals did more to help John F. Kennedy get elected than his running mate, Lyndon Johnson, who had an immeasurable impact on JFK's victory in the 1960 election. Yet it must also be noted that before that inspired partnership, the two men were rivals. This comes as no surprise, as throughout their lives, both were fiercely competitive. My favorite anecdote about LBJ, perhaps apocryphal, is the story that after his presidential library opened, the former president wanted to ensure that its visitation numbers topped those of all the other presidential libraries. So he came up with a novel strategy. As you may know, the library is on the campus of the University of Texas and located right next to the football stadium. Have them announce at halftime, LBJ allegedly urged, that there are plenty of bathrooms with no lines at my library, knowing that each restroom visitor could then be included in the library's overall visitation statistics. And don't think when those numbers are periodically released today that the presidential library directors don't immediately look to see how we compare with our peers. The only time the Kennedy-Johnson rivalry led to a face-to-face exchange was when LBJ invited JFK to a debate before the Texas caucus at the beginning of the 1960 convention, which LBJ hoped would be brokered in order to provide an opportunity for him to be nominated. His critique of JFK that he was too young, referring to Kennedy as a lightweight who needed a little gray in his hair. Quote, "The forces of evil will have no mercy for innocence," he proclaimed, "no gallantry for inexperience." And in their impromptu debate, without mentioning JFK by name, LBJ contrasted the absenteeism of some senators with his own dedicated leadership in the United States Senate. I assume, JFK replied when it was his turn to speak, that Senator Johnson was talking about some other candidate, not me. I want to commend him for a wonderful record in answering quorum calls. I was not present on all those occasions. I was not majority leader. So I come here today full of admiration for Senator Johnson, full of affection for him, and strongly in support of him as majority leader. Having deftly defeated LBJ's last-minute challenge, JFK went on to win the nomination on the first ballot and immediately reached out to Lyndon Johnson to serve as his running mate, a decision that would change the course of history, a portion of which is now retold in compelling fashion by my friend and colleague Mark Updegrove in his new book, Indomitable Will, LBJ and the Presidency. As one reviewer has written, Mark Updegrove offers not another great man biography, but rather an innovative, illuminating, extraordinary portrait of a fascinating, contradictory, and enduringly important president. This new volume artfully combines LBJ in his own words, others' observations on what he did and how he did it, and transcripts of key LBJ phone conversations, leading to a balanced, full-disclosure depiction of our 36th president. Our moderator this evening is John Avlon, senior columnist for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, as well as a CNN commentator. He's the author of Independent Nation, How Centrists Can Change American Politics, and editor of Deadline Artists, America's Greatest Newspaper Columns. A forum speechwriter for New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani. After the attacks of September 11th, he and his team were responsible for writing the eulogies of the city's fallen policemen and firefighters, and an essay he wrote on the attacks won acclaim as the single best piece written in the wake of the tragedy. One commentator has written that Mr. Avlon talks about politics the way ESPN anchors wrap up sports highlights, captured perfectly by the title of one of his best-selling books, Wingnuts, How the Lunatic Fringe is Hijacking America. Let me note that John is married to Margaret Hoover, who is President Hoover's great-granddaughter and who's here with us this evening. Lady Bird Johnson once granted an interview with two students who were researching a National History Day project in which they would write and perform a dramatic dialogue between Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King. They told her the stage would be simple, with the two students seated side by side with a bit of dry ice to make it look like heaven, Lady Bird said. What makes you think Lyndon made it up there? Wherever Lyndon Johnson's soul may rest, I trust he is looking with favor upon these proceedings, proud that we've gathered to discuss his presidency, though chagrined that given the choice between our two libraries, C-SPAN has chosen Boston over Austin to record a session on this new groundbreaking book, which means the Kennedy Library gets to count those millions of viewers as part of our outreach statistics. But with all sincerity, Mark, I nod my head, gray-haired though it may be, with respect and admiration for you, for this new biography, for the Johnson Presidential Library, and for the man it so masterfully honors. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the Kennedy Library Mark Updegrove and John Avlon.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Well, I guess the competition between political leaders never really ends. But Mark, I mean, this is an extraordinary book you've done, Indomitable Will. It is a portrait of a man by those who knew him, but it doesn't fall into that trap of so many oral histories because it's thematic, and you really get a sense of what Johnson's leadership style was. And it is such a contrasting leadership style with many other presidents. And because we're here at the JFK Library, the book begins with that awful moment of his ascension to the presidency, where Lady Bird Johnson says so memorably, people looked at the living and wished for the dead. That burden upon which he assumed the presidency and the contrast between those two styles. Talk a little bit about that relationship and how they were received.
Thanks, John. And I will answer the question, but I do want to respond to my dear friend and my colleague, Tom Putnam, by saying, A, the story is true, and B, I think we had more visitors last year than the JFK Library, but I'm not. The two were completely different. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson were fundamentally different human beings. And I think that LBJ was keenly aware that he was succeeding somebody who was so graceful and who was almost set an impossible standard by which to be measured, partly because of his martyrdom. But Liz Carpenter, who worked for Mrs. Johnson, worked for both of the Johnsons, and was kind of the Dorothy Parker of the political set in the 1960s, I think encapsulated the differences between the two men very eloquently. She said that, I think that presidents can be summed up in one word: Kennedy inspired, which Johnson was incapable of doing, and Johnson delivered. And I think that's absolutely true. If John F. Kennedy, in my view, begs to be judged by his words. He's so inspiring, he's so eloquent, he's so visionary. Ask not what your country could do for you. Ich bin ein Berliner. We choose the moon. And Johnson begs to be judged by his deeds, what he accomplished, what he did. He wasn't telegenic. He wasn't particularly graceful as a media personality. But he delivered. He knew how to get things done. And if you look at his legislative record, this is a formidable president, and probably the most important president legislatively in my lifetime. And look at the full sweep of the Great Society and how it resonates today. It is absolutely remarkable.
One of the things, I do think that the way Johnson is being remembered going forward, that legislative accomplishment is such a clear contrast with not just Kennedy, but so many other presidents. Someone who really knew Washington, someone who knew how to get things done. And yet someone who, even in our sort of demythologized age, was such a vivid figure. And you quote person after person who worked for him, talking about the complexity of man, the way that he embodied all these contradictions that were vivid and in your face, that he could be profane and patriotic and inspiring and then take you off balance and intimidating. I wonder if the choice to do this oral biography, is that in part a way to capture the different facets of this complex personality?
You know, I think that the challenge that a biographer has in capturing Lyndon Johnson is he is so enormously complex. And the way that I ensured that this was even-handed and balanced, which I think a lot of the